to the question, who are we and who are we as a people of faith? We talked a couple of weeks ago about we're a people of faith that are grounded in the Word and that we find our foundation in the reality of Scripture as we understand God speaking to us through it. And last week we talked about history and tradition and said that we don't need to reinvent the wheel every day in our Christian life, but the history of the church and the creeds and the saints who have walked before us and the people that we know as saints all prepare us for living a life of faith. This morning we talk about experience. Our experiences. One of the joys of being a pastor is you hear people tell their stories of life and faith. Some of them are pretty boring, and some of them are just off the chart. And you don't know how to deal with them, and they're real. And they're as different as people are. John Wesley, who was the one who launched Methodism as part of the Christian church, went to a Bible study where they read the preface to Romans from Luther. Now, I know that's a lot of different ways of looking at words when John Wesley read that, but those are not the kind of thing that make you too excited. And John Wesley was not the kind of person that got very excited. He was an Anglican clergyman who was trained in a day when you were suspicious of anyone who was too excited. And by his very nature, he was straight-laced and all that. And when he said, "My heart was strangely warmed," some of us would have been raising our hands and shouting for all that God was doing, but that was a pretty emotional statement for someone like John Wesley. What I'm saying about experience is our experiences are not the same. I am thankful that we do not have just one way, and particular way, to experience God's love and God's grace, but that God speaks to us through the uniqueness of who we are and how we relate to things. But experience. Either our experiences of faith or our other experiences in life mold us and shape us. Sometimes in powerfully exciting ways, and sometimes in ways that can tear us apart. Experience is at the heart of our Christian faith. Experience is our recognition of God's working in our lives and interacting with us. Don Stroh, the former United Methodist pastor at Ann Arbor First some 40 years ago, said, "It is the birthright of every Christian to know God as a reality in his or her own personal life, not merely hearsay." What he was saying is, we can hear a lot of things that other people are saying about faith, but we have the birthright of knowing that we can experience God's love and God's grace. He went on to say, our personal experience of God's pardoning and healing love is radically different from an intellectual assent to the message of the Bible or doctrines of the Creed. Sometimes it's easy for us to sign on the dotted line that we believe something, but have we experienced it? Those are two very different things, and the believing is critically important, but it is the experience that enlivens us. Our experiences are not going to all be the same because we are very different. And our experiences, some of them are overtly religious, and other times they are experiences that impact our psyche in a way that makes us easier to listen to God's love and God's grace. I'm going to talk about two experiences that have had an impact on me in the last number of years. One was, I believe, mentioned here that I spent a year outside at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire when our granddaughter was born, our only grandchild. And I can tell you stories about her being the most brilliant first grader that's ever lived. But some of you have grandchildren too, so that would not be a helpful discussion for us to have that. But we moved out there after I had taken a year-long interim, and Susan was to be the primary caretaker for our granddaughter Orla during the year that we were there, and she had just been born. And I helped a little bit, But I did a lot more hiking on the Appalachian Trail and other things and of some support, and I think Orla's probably better off that Susan had the primary care for that. But I had been hiking quite a bit, and I said to our son, I'm going to hike Mount Moosilauke. And he looked at me and he said, Dad, you're not as young as you used to be. And I said, you think I can't do it? And he said, I'm not saying that, but it would be probably, well, you ought to think twice about it. I said, you hike it? Well, yeah, but I'm a lot younger than you are. That only made me stronger in my determination to hike the mountain. My wife, Susan, was more direct and less tactful in saying, you have no business doing that, you shouldn't do that, you hike with somebody else, or blah, blah, blah. And I said, I can do it. And even my daughter-in-law, sweet Ashley, said, are you sure that's a good idea? I was not going to listen to that, and I did not. I packed some water, I packed some extra health food, I was going to make it. It was 4 or 5 miles up and 4 or 5 miles back, and well, I can do that. It'll tax me a little bit. Oh, before I got to the top of the mountain, I'd eaten all my food, drank the water, and had used all the oxygen that my lungs could handle. I finally got to the top, and I thought, well, getting down, at least I can roll my way down, and I'll make it back. But I was so exhausted, I laid down in the sand there, trying to get my breath and just enjoying the sun and thinking, what have I done? Little did I know what the locals called sand fleas were having a feast. I started back down the mountain. Every time I met someone coming up, they'd say, are you all right? And I would say, of course I am. Like a grouchy old man that I was. I made it out, but barely. Now, what of that experience? Well, that experience was not an overtly spiritual experience, although I did call on God to carry me out of there. But it was a reminder that people close to me may have a better understanding of who I am than I do. And that my bullheadedness is not the healthiest way to live. I can only say that because Susan is not here, and I hope none of this ever gets back to her. But we've had that discussion. So you say Mount Moosilauke, and you might say, oh, that's a pretty good mountain to hike on the Appalachian Trail, it's no big deal. But when I say it, I think of all the sand flea bites, I think of how I really thought for part of the time I wasn't going to make it. I think about all the advice I had. You get the picture. That experience has molded me. I still hike places that my family doesn't think I should, but at least I don't go as far. Those experiences can have an impact on us. A second story. Doug Mercer was the district superintendent of the Flint district a number of years ago. And when he was done being district superintendent, he was a regular worshiper at Court Street. He called me on a Thursday and said, can I have 2 minutes of time Sunday morning to make an announcement? I said, well, what's it all about? And he said, I'd like to have us organize a Katrina work trip to work with UMCOR. I just got back with one from a church in Lansing where my wife's cousin is there, and it was a fabulous experience. I said, okay. Doug stopped in a few minutes before the worship service that Sunday, and he told me a little bit what he was saying. I hadn't planned it. Out of the blue, I said, mark me down as the first recruit. Well, he got 15 or so recruits in a couple of weeks, and in a couple of months, or 3 months, we went off to Katrina, where Katrina had damaged in New Orleans. That was a powerful experience for me. I thought I understood what suffering could be like. I saw the buildings in that 7th Ward where we were taking insulation and everything out of the inside so the crews that came after us could spray down mold inhibitors, and then the rebuilding could be. And there were these X signs on the buildings. I don't remember what all of them said, but all of them were. One was the date that it was inspected. One was the group that inspected, usually the Louisiana National Guard. One was the number of people that had died in that building or were unaccounted for. And it became very real. And as we started to work there and started to do this dirty manual labor that felt good, even in March when the temperature was a lot hotter than I would have expected it to be, the people that came by and said, volunteers like you are giving us some hope. I couldn't look at those people in the way that I had before. I tried to pass it off and say, oh, that's nothing, but it was something. It was something to them, and it was something to us. And the 15 or so of us who had come from Court Street were touched by all of this and the support that the church had given. Now, I don't have all the answers around flooding, but just like you mentioned Mount Busalek, I have an impact on what it did to my body and my psyche. What being there at the first Katrina work trip I was involved gave me a different perspective of those who had very little and had lost what they had had. Life was never the same. UMCOR, United Methodist Committee on Relief, I always was a champion of that. You'd have an offering once a year, you'd try to raise a little bit of money. But after having been there, I look at it in a whole different way. Not as an expert, but as one who was touched by it, and one who was challenged by how God was working in them. At the heart of our experience, at the heart of our faith, are some experiences where God intersects in our busy lives and we're never the same. There's value in remembering these. Remembering these personal experiences and remembering the experiences of others. And one thing that I want to emphasize in my life is that they're not all the same. Some people have experiences like this and they just happen to be driving down the road and something pops in their brain and life changes. There is no formula, but there is a connection with God. The second thing I want us to remember is our experience of faith does not end with our introduction to the saving grace of God. When I'm introduced to someone at a party and we talk and exchange a couple of stories, is it really a relationship if we never interact again? I don't think so. Beginning to relationships is very important, but it is the continuity and is the living on that have an impact. Scripture is a record of people experiencing God and challenging Him, but not just usually a one-time, no matter how important it is usually the entree to a lifelong experiences. Our stories of faith, as dramatic as they are important. But it's what we do with those stories and those experiences that make a real difference as we move on. A third thought about our experiences of faith, or our experiences. I need to test my experiences against Scripture, against tradition, against reason, and with the community of faith. You know why? Because sometimes it is too many ribs the night before that are giving me thoughts, not God. Sometimes it's too much pizza. Sometimes it's just the fallibility of our own humanity, and we need to be reminded that where does God fit into this? Where does Scripture fit into this? Or if I believe God is telling me to do some harm to someone, I try to find a place in Scripture where that is the reality, but it isn't. Let me suggest a couple of things about our understanding of our experiences. When I was pastoring in Marquette, I thought I had an agreement with the bishop that I could stay for 3 more years so our son, who was going to be a sophomore in high school, could graduate from Marquette High School. The district superintendent was Ken Ward, friend of mine, nice guy. And he called me and said, "Steve, this is not a social call." Well, when you're a United Methodist pastor and you get a call like that from the district superintendent, you know they have other plans for you and life is going to change. By the next few moments, he told me that the bishop wanted me to come to Flint Court Street. And I said, what in the world have you people been drinking? I don't want to go there. I'm not a city guy. I am a cross between a suburban guy and a Northwoods guy. And no, you've got it all wrong. And he said, well, the bishop feels pretty strongly about this. And I hung up the phone. I had 48 hours to get back with them, but I knew that whatever I was going to say wasn't going to make a lot of difference. But something started to happen. From that very night, I sensed that when I got out of the way that maybe this was something that would be good. I called a very dear friend, which you're not supposed to do, and told him what was going on, and can you take care of our daughter who is just 2 years old while we drive down to Flint to see what it looks like. We did that with our son with us. And all of the while, I was thinking, this isn't what I want, but maybe I should be doing it. By the time the 48 hours were up, I had called and said, I don't know what you guys have got planned, and I'm not going to really give God credit for this, but I'm feeling like this may be what I should do, and I'll be doing it. And they said, well, you were going to do it whether you wanted to or not, but I had a sense that it was right. No writing on the wall, no great bells and whistles, just a sense that God was in it. And so people that I valued highly affirmed that. Now, I still saw myself someplace else, but 15 years later, I'd been the longest pastor in terms of length at that church. And I would have stayed another 5 or 6 years till I retired if the new bishop didn't have some other ideas. But what I'm saying is that our experience of how God works in our lives can sometimes surprise us. What do we do when we sense God is working in our lives? I think first of all we look at Scripture and we try to understand whether this is congruent with Scripture. And then I believe it is important to share in a community of faith, whether it's a whole church or just a few people, where you are able to share and get some sense of what God is doing. And also a sense that what I'm asking God to do is not something I would necessarily want to do, and that speaks more highly of what God is doing. Let me share another experience. We'll try to sort it out. A young boy by the name of Matthew was born to one of the leading young families in the Royal Oak United Methodist Church, where I was an associate. Matthew was born with limited mental capabilities. The brain had been damaged. There was all sorts of things. The family was the most perfect young Christian family there was. The child was not supposed to live more than a week or two, and now it had been 8 or 10 months. I stopped by to see him every couple or 3 weeks. They were an epitome of a family that valued their son even in his diminished capacity, but it was draining them emotionally, psychologically, and every other way. I think it was a Thursday afternoon, about 4 o'clock, and I had one of those rotten days, probably because of I'll claim that it was my fault, but it was a day where everything was just going wrong. I said, I'm going home, I'm going to get something to eat because I got to come back for a meeting. And it was a job description where there were always 15 things on the list to do and only time to get 3 or 4 of them done. As I left the church to drive north the 2 miles to the parsonage that I lived in, I started thinking about Kathy and her husband and Matthew. I got about a mile up the road, and I didn't say anything audibly, but I was thinking, okay, God, if you're going to bother me over this, I'll turn around and go see him. I turned around, went down a mile the other side of the church, and Kathy had been having a day that was much, much worse than my trivial day that I had a few problems with. She laid out what was going on and how they were dealing with insurance and doctors and all the other things that were going on, and Matthew was not doing very well. I did what pastors do. I had a prayer. I turned it over to God because I certainly didn't have any answers. And as I was getting ready to say amen, the phone rang, and she said, I better get that. It's probably one of the insurance people. And then I heard her go, oh no. And the conversation went down with her quickly. Her husband, a 39-year-old CPA, had had a heart attack working in the Rinsen and was being rushed to the hospital. She didn't have another car there. I was able to make phone calls, get her in the car, get the child taken care of. The other child would be getting out of school or out of brownies or something, then picked up. The community of faith wrapped their arms around her. We got down to the hospital. To make a long story short, her husband had a full recovery. What was that experience? Was it one of those grand coincidences? It might have been. But it said to me that it was more than that, that my being there at that time, not that I was going to perform any miracles, but the church could be closer around and help. I'm not the only one that has had these kind of experiences, and I'm not ready to say that every time I find a parking place close to the front, God has saved it for me, because that's not where I'm at in my theology. But I also understand that God can put us in places where experiences happen, where the interaction between us and some in need and God are there, and all I can do is say, Lord, help me. We are a people of God who believe that experience is important. Both our initial experience in faith, our experiences of growing, but our experiences of being used by God. The text for today is Jesus calling his disciples. I sense they had no idea what they were getting into. But they got into something. They got into something where they would experience Jesus, where they would grow, where life would not be the same. And Jesus didn't call them to say, come and watch with me. He didn't call them to say, I've got tickets in the 4th row for the Super Bowl. Come and watch what's going on. He said, come and follow me. And in following me, we are fluid in action and preparing ourselves to live life. Jesus didn't call them to analyze. Some of us are cursed with the thoughts that we can analyze everything and find the answer, and then that'll save humanity. Well, Jesus didn't call us just to analyze. He called us to follow. To follow. To experience every day of life. That grace that opens us to the possibility of God interacting with us and others. We are being called today not only to a one-time experience of God's love for us, but a way of life that enlivens our faith by the experience of God's grace and God's love. To God be the glory. Amen.